NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has announced that the blast in Poland was caused by Ukrainian air defense missile. This comes after the missile that landed on a Polish grains facility initially raised global alarm that the Ukraine war could spill into neighboring countries. The confirmation that the missile was not fired by Russia helped ease the pressure. Stoltenberg was speaking during a news conference after an emergency meeting of NATO ambassadors. Poland is a member of the US-led military alliance NATO, which is committed to collective defense. All right, let's now bring in Dr. Dorcas Ettang. She is the Senior Lecturer of Political Science, specialising in conflict and peace at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Doctor, thanks so very much for joining us here on SABC News.
Thank you for having me.
All right, well, let's start here. Initially, it had been reported that Russia had in fact fired the missile that hit Poland, but new details, of course, now emerging that it was in fact Ukraine. Let's talk about all of this in terms of what this means then when we're talking about international relations and no real reason or wanting to have any kind of peace negotiations when we're putting blame where it shouldn't be.
Yes, I think this case speaks clearly to how one conflict can have significant impact on neighboring countries and the world at large. And so while the conflict initially began between Ukraine and Russia, the potential of it spreading to countries like Poland is what we see happening. And so regardless of who the actors are in the conflict at the initial stage, the plans or the potential for it to expand is what we're seeing now. And so when there's also a lack of clarity of who is to blame with regards to who shot the missile and all of that, it also further complicates a very fragile peace process and so on. And I think this just shows you how complex conflict is. And so I think countries need to be very careful of making assumptions and conclusions without having the facts in hand.
Dr. Ettang, interestingly, you say that because Poland was very quick to come out and say, there would be a very tough response to this if Russia is found to be behind the attack. And now that we have new information, and in fact we hear that it's in fact not Russia, does that tone need to change? And does is Russia owed, some sort of an apology?
The tone needs to change, and this speaks to political leadership and how their actions and statements can have significant impact very early on. And in calling for peace and in trying to resolve this peacefully, I think it is very important, like countries like Poland retract their statements and try and be very careful in making conflicts or statements that could create more conflict. I think the United States president has shown some kind of restraint in owning up to the fact that perhaps this was not from Russia, but Ukraine. And I think this is very key. And the role of political leadership and the statements they make are very significant in processes like this.
Could this have the potential of aggravating Russia further? But then one needs to ask, is Russia in fact aggravated at this point?
Of course, we've seen Russia still engage in significant attack in Ukraine, and we're looking at months down the line, right? We don't see any sort of lessening of militarization. We don't see lessening of violence. Ukraine has felt it really strongly. Its power stations have been affected and so on. The hope is that countries try to minimize the conflict going forward and try and resolve the issues between the two key parties without trying to expand and perhaps cause more damage across country lines and so on and so forth. The hope is that I think, Russia is quite quick to admit that this is not ours. We do not own this missile. And so that's a good sign where there's ownership of one's responsibility in the process.
Yeah.
And hopefully this doesn't lead to more aggravation. But again, Russia hasn't relented, right? We're still seeing attacks on key stations in Ukraine.
Yeah, you talk about resolving the issue, and of course we know that world leaders are indeed currently meeting at the G20. What do you believe are some of the issues that the leaders should be looking into as we address, this end to what we've been calling a war?
The immediate cessation, the immediate stopping of violence is absolutely a priority. Human lives are at risk. We see that Poland itself has lost 2 citizens because of this missile. And so that has to be priority. How do we immediately stop the violence to ensure that human life is preserved and protected? With violence comes the destruction of power stations, of key lifelines for individuals and communities. And so without a cessation of violence, how do we create the space for peaceful talks and so on? And so that's, for me, is the initial stage. Are both parties willing? Months down the line, I think that's the question. And when countries are still, supporting either parties, be it Russia or Ukraine, in various ways, then we ask ourselves if we see the end at some point. But again, human life is priority. We need to stop the violence completely.
But let's also get a bit realistic. Let's just say that Russia had indeed launched this particular missile into Poland. Are any of the NATO countries actually willing to start World War III over something like this with Russia? I mean, for Russia to have a threat from Poland, I mean, that's quite bizarre.
Looking at the behaviors and the decisions of political leadership, be it members of NATO or the key parties to the conflict, it really is unpredictable, in my opinion. One would have thought the war would never reach this level of escalation, right? One thought, well, with the presence of the UN and, efforts by various parties to engage with both Zelensky and Putin, one would have thought there would be some kind of prevention. However, this has failed, right? And we see that in spite of the impact of the conflict across the world, food insecurity, the rise of petrol costs, the conflict is still going on. And so in spite of this, are countries willing to deal with the issues and try and resolve it? One can just keep looking, right? It's very unpredictable. I think state interests, individual interests, all play a role in this case.
Yeah. Doctor, you're talking about the conflict still going on, but one also needs to ask the question of whether or not Ukraine itself wants to put an end to all of this. Strangely, Zelensky himself was very quick to call for Article 5 to be triggered, effectively for nuclear then to be used. That sounds quite extreme, doesn't it? It is also showing that Zelensky desperately wants some kind of NATO involvement in all of this.
One can argue that. And I think this is how politics and the political stage continues to evolve, right? Because at the end of the day, there will be consequences. I don't think Ukraine or Russia will be exempt from the consequences that a full-scale world war would have on them. And I reiterated this in the beginning. Statements are very insightful. Statements can further complicate and worsen an already fragile situation. And so when these statements are made, I guess there's an element of trying to have a bold front and speak on behalf of one's country and the people and so on, but the consequences will be detrimental. And so I hope that at the level of political leadership, statements are really made with caution, and that's essentially the end of the conflict is what they want.
Yeah. All right, Doctor, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Hope to have more conversations with you on this. We appreciate your input, ma'am.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. That is Dr. Dorcas Ettang. She's a senior lecturer of political science, specialising in conflict and peace at the University of KwaZulu-Natal.